Okay. Just. All right. I'm keeping an eye on the live stream today with no volume on, so I see if it kicks out. Okay, so last time we were talking about families. I'm just going to go back to a Q&A slide here very quickly to check if everything's working and all of that jazz. So, yeah, we were talking about families and some of the new kind of norms and standards that are coming along in the world today. So, perfect. Everything's working. We ended off on this slide, right, talking about, we were talking about cohabitation first, and then we moved on to some of the new vocabulary that comes, with the changes in sexual norms that we're seeing in society. Okay, so one of the other big changes in sort of norms around sex and sexuality has obviously been increasing tolerance and acceptance of LGBTQ people, specifically, starting in the 1990s of lesbian and gay people, and this has sort of continued to roll in major ways. Okay, so yeah, worldwide, so Canada was one of the first countries in the world to change the definition of a family and specifically marriage to include same-sex partners. This happened around 2004, 2005. Other countries, some European states, came a little bit before, a little bit after, and then the United States, legalized same-sex marriage in a Supreme Court decision called Obergefell, which is not, I won't write it, it's not important. Obergefell v. Hodges in 2015 that basically declared that any definition of marriage that excluded same-sex persons or same-sex couples was unconstitutional. So, yeah, I mean, we've now come to see, in Canada particularly, but in a lot of parts of the West, same-sex marriage and same-sex marriage and same-sex couples as increasingly within this definition of what we think of as the family. Now, it remains a relatively small phenomenon. If we look at, Canada, the 2016 census recorded 72,800 same-sex couple households, which basically accounted for, around or less than 1% of all couples in Canada. So the norm in Canada remains, opposite sex, heterosexual couples, but at least in social acceptance, Canada has a kind of wide social acceptance of same-sex couples. When same-sex marriage was initially sort of passed in the Canadian Parliament, it was very controversial. But if you look at the position today, the majority of Canadians today, somewhere around, a little bit more than 2/3, agree that same-sex people should be allowed to marry. So we've seen a broad shift in social attitudes in a very, very quick period. Okay, now that said, in terms of kind of the breakdown of these couples, right, slightly more kind of gay couples than lesbian couples. Most of them have no children in the house, right? So they are childless couples. And, the majority of them remain common law rather than married. Only about 1/3 of same-sex couples are married, and less than 10% have children in the household. So, I mean, this percentage sort of has gone up a little bit over time, right? In 2001, it wasn't legal, so it was 0%, and it's gone up kind of steadily, but it seems to have kind of, capped around 1/3 of same-sex couples that choose to get married. The rest do not choose to do so. Okay. Right, so I talked about I talked about this last class. So I already ruined what's on this slide. But yeah, basically, divorce, has been around as a legal process in English common law really since the 17th century, or 16th century. Yeah, I guess the 16th century, as something that was broadly allowed. But it was always very, very difficult. So prior to 1968, basically it was only allowed on the grounds of adultery. In some places, like Nova Scotia, cruelty was also permitted. Now, it was extremely difficult to get a divorce even on the grounds of adultery because you had to prove it, with a preponderance of the evidence. So it had to be more than a 50% bet that there had been adultery. So basically, you had to have some kind of solid evidence, right? So something like both people signed a hotel ledger, or this hotel staff, repeatedly saw you going there and meeting with another person. So a little bit of discretion made this really, really difficult. It also had to be, in turn, both parties had to sign off on it. So basically what tended to happen is that couples who were unhappy would separate and basically remain married, which in a lot of cases made lives, especially for women, really, really difficult because they were unable to remarry after that point. So they had the choice of either, living with someone to whom they were not married, which had huge social consequences, or remaining married to someone they weren't living with, which precluded a lot of other things also. So this isn't fundamentally changed in Canadian law until 1968. So 1968, the federal government passes the Divorce Act and changes it so that basically you can be separated, or so you can be divorced for, adultery, cruelty, or after 3 years of separation. So it expanded the grounds for divorce and made it a lot easier. Now, it was still relatively difficult, but you sort of saw, a spike in divorces there. In 1985, it was further amended, and basically this is what we call no-fault divorce, right? So when your favorite Hollywood celebrity, right, they go off and they get married, and then 2 weeks later they come back and you hear that they're getting divorced because of irreconcilable differences. This is basically what we call no-fault divorce, right? So you don't have to prove anything like adultery or cruelty. You don't need any of that. You don't need a reason. You can just say, we have irreconcilable differences. We don't want to be married anymore. And basically, the 85 Divorce Act said that you needed a 1-year period of separation. After which point, so if you can prove that you've been separated for 1 year, you can then basically file for divorce, right? So you can file to be divorced from your spouse at that point. So anything after that, and you have to prove things like you had different residences, right? So you have to send bills to a new address and all of this stuff. But yeah, you need a 1-year period of separation. Okay. With the passage of the 1985 Divorce Act, we saw a huge spike in divorces, and it's now somewhere around 41% of marriages end in divorce before the 30th year of marriage. So, less than half, it had spiked up above half, and it's been coming down steadily kind of since the 1990s. Now, again, one of the things that plays into this is fewer people are getting married, more people are cohabiting now than at any time in the past. Okay, so what predicts divorce? So there's a bunch of factors. What are the predictors of divorce? So like interpersonal factors, unhappiness with your spouse is obviously one of them, right? And this is most often phrased as people who fell out of love, right? We don't love each other anymore. There's something about the other person that no longer makes you happy. Personal happiness has become paramount in kind of questions of divorce in lots of ways. Conflict, right? And the big one when it comes to conflict is money. Conflicts over money are very important when it comes to divorce. And it's actually like the number one kind of predictor of divorce is financial problems within the family or financial disagreements. And so you can put things like, when it comes to money, gambling, right? Gambling. Don't gamble. It's bad for your marriage. Gambling and overspending, the shopaholic. Too much shopping will tend to cause, financial difficulties, which will then often lead to divorce. One of my friends from university, huge gambler, huge gambling problem, and yeah, exactly what happened is, he went off to Vegas for a boys' weekend, proceeded to lose $15,000, and his wife was not too happy, and that was the last straw for her, because it wasn't the first time that he had lost that sum of money. Substance abuse or mental health problems, right? So if one or the other person is suffering with substance abuse or mental health problems, right, that will typically lead to, well, it doesn't typically lead, it is one of the big contributors to divorce and infidelity, right, cheating, including, right, increasingly we see kind of questions about, emotional infidelity or emotional cheating, people having emotional affairs, right? This can be, or even just having things like online dating profiles, this can be something that people use as a reason for divorce. Okay, demographic factors. Women are much more likely to initiate divorce than men, and it's something between 8-1 and sometimes 9-1 depending on the jurisdiction. So basically 8 to 9 times, 8 to 2, 9-1, 8 to 2, 9-1. So 8 times out of 10 or 9 times out of 10, women are the ones who initiate the end of a marriage or a long-term relationship. And this has especially changed since women re-entered the workforce in major parts in the 1960s and 70s, have more economic power, and therefore are less dependent on their male partners. So divorce is more likely to occur also in the earlier years of marriage. There's no hard and fast rule. Some people say it's like the 7 years, and after that you're out of the risk period. Some people say it's 10, but basically is more likely to mean that you're going to stay married. And this, just comes down to the fact that most religions prize marriage in major ways, right? Marriage is a major part of, say, especially when we're talking about the West. Christianity has very particular notions of to get divorced. Being less educated. So the biggest chunk of people that we see getting divorced are actually those with a high school education or less. So high school or less, if you get married. Oops, school has a C. High school or less, much higher chance that you're going to get divorced. The more education you have, so like people with a 4-year college degree, less likely. People with a graduate degree, less likely. PhDs, less likely even. Again, it's not that it doesn't happen, but it's less and less likely the more education that you have. Cohabiting before marriage. So this is especially true, for millennials and Gen Z. A lot of them think of cohabiting before marriage as a way to test out a relationship so that you work out the problems before you actually get married to the person. But that doesn't seem to be the case, right? It slightly increases your chances of getting divorced. And it's probably, again, down to social attitudes. Less traditional, therefore less likely to view marriage as sort of a permanent union. And then, premarital birth or a previous marriage. So if you have a kid before you get married, more likely you're going to get divorced. I tried to warn one of my friends about this. He's now divorced. She had a kid before they got married. And I'm like, did you know that by the social statistics? And that didn't go well, by the way. I was like, all the research suggests that if they have a kid before they get married, you're much more likely to get divorced. I did not throw that in his face after he got divorced, but I should have, now that I think. Maybe I'll call him after class and be like, do you remember that conversation we had? Probably not a good idea. Also, he's a plumber and I need him to fix things around my house. So I'm gonna keep that in my back pocket. Okay. So previous relationships, previous marriages, births before you get married. If someone baby traps you, That doesn't generally indicate good things. So, and yeah, having grown up in a household without two married parents, so that's the other thing, and this is highly class-based and becoming more so. If your parents got divorced, you are much more likely yourself to get divorced. If you and your partner's parents both got divorced, you are completely screwed. No, not completely. I'm joking, but mostly. Okay. Consequences of divorce. It's the shortest video clip in the course. So when we talk about the consequences of divorce, usually people are wanting the following. Oh,
won't somebody please
it's not working. Oh my gosh, I forgot to turn the sound on. Let's try it again.
Won't somebody please think of the children?
Yes, won't somebody think of the children? Right, so specifically, especially kind of early on when divorce was growing as a social phenomenon in the 80s and 90s, people were really, really worried about the effect that divorce would have on children. So, one of the early studies, right, basically found that children in the households of divorced parents did worse, right? They did worse in school. Their long-term health outcomes were worse. Their long-term educational and economic outcomes were worse, right? They got into more trouble. They had sex earlier. They had a higher risk of teen pregnancies, all of these sorts of things, right? So the early kind of studies of divorced children of divorced parents showed, huge deficits. And it's been, here I have it, these early studies were deeply flawed, and they were. I would say since then, the studies are kind of like 50-50. With about half the studies suggesting major deficits for the children of divorce, and half of them suggesting that if the conditions are just right, that it can actually turn out okay. So, basically, the early studies, why were they flawed? Okay, so a lot of the children in the study were coming from the homes with the most contentious marriages. So they were already struggling in lots of ways before their parents got divorced. They were observational studies rather than randomized control studies, so there was no control group. There was no kind of comparison with, how their peers whose parents didn't get divorced were doing. There was no sort of measure to see, where they sat. It was like, okay, their life outcomes are not great. Okay, but it didn't compare them to their peers whose parents weren't divorced. And, it didn't really look at whether problems existed prior to the divorce. They didn't have data on how the children were doing before, just after. And so they were seen in some ways as ideological. Okay, so today, actually I haven't seen it. Uh-oh. That can't be good. It was working before. Hang on a sec. All right, I'm going to try. Slido seems to be working fine. Why are you lying to me, computer? Oh, whatever. Whatever. Okay. Everything works again. Huzzah. Okay, so most researchers today kind of looking at divorce are coming to it from a perspective of what's called stress theory. And basically stress theory, I would say is probably more of a sort of interactionist kind of viewpoint when it comes to family. And basically, symbolic interactionist, and basically suggests that there's no, hard and fast rule, that this social institution breaks down and then people don't do well because they need the social institution. That'd be the functionalist perspective, or that marriage is oppressive and everybody's better without it. It's more like much of it is contingent on the circumstances. So basically, what it says is, divorce requires an adjustment to new circumstances, right? Especially for kids. And there are certain ways that some of the more harmful consequences of divorce can ultimately be mitigated. So, when is divorce less bad for parents? Okay. So there's a couple of things. I'll say a couple of things that aren't on the slide. I'll say a couple of things that are. So divorce tends to be less bad for kids if the parents were in a state of constant contention, right? They were fighting all the damn time. And so it was causing a lot of stress for children within the married home. Divorce can be good for these kids because it gets them out of their parents having sort of daily or repeated fights with each other, right? So that tends to, if it's a very contentious household, leaving that household might be good for the kids. Okay, the other thing, and you can kind of, sum all of this up into routines and care, right? The less changes are made to a kid's routine, the less, there's a disruption to their life, the better it is. Oh, okay, this is not prescriptive, so don't take this as, one day you get married and you have a kid and you're not happy in your marriage, and then you're like, my sociology professor said, get divorced early, rather than trying to work it out. This is not prescriptive. I'm not telling you what to do, so don't take this as advice. But generally speaking, kids whose parents got divorced earlier in their lives tend to do better than people whose parents got divorced when they were teenagers. Simply put, the longer you've been in a situation where you had both parents present and that gets taken away, the more likely it is to be super disruptive to your life. So let's say, pardon me, let's say your parents got divorced when you were 2 years old. You don't remember any difference, right? You don't remember when your parents were together and how that was different. That just becomes your normal. However, if you're 14 and your parents get divorced, then you're at much greater risk of having adverse effects, because suddenly the whole stability that's been there your whole life and this whole kind of sense of what your world is sort of breaks apart at that point. Okay, a couple of other things that are important. When parents continue to provide children with assurance and affirmation, and especially if the non-resident parent, right? Because what typically happens is one parent moves out and the children live predominantly with the other parent. So the more they have kind of regular access to the non-resident parent, daily is ideal, but at least once or twice a week is good as well, the more likely they are to get that reassurance, that parent still loves them and it's not their fault and all of those things. So that tends to mitigate a lot of the problems. Minimizing other changes to daily routines. One of the worst things that people do, and this often happens because, say, they sell the house they were living in and because they can't afford it. So one of the worst things that you can do if you have kids is to move, right? And especially move them schools, change their friends groups, cancel their activities because you've moved to a different part of the city. So if you can minimize the disruption to children's daily routines, that ultimately is better. Separating them from their friends and upending their whole social world tends to be really, really bad. And dividing them from other caring adults that are part of their kind of circle, right? So teachers especially. When they're encouraged to talk about their feelings, so kids are given space to say how they feel, that is better as well. Okay, conversely, right, it's worse when parents are too overwhelmed to be effective caregivers. So especially single parents, and here mostly single moms, because that's usually how it goes, suddenly find themselves economically disadvantaged, having to work maybe 2 jobs or more to support their kids. If the other parent's a deadbeat and not paying child support, that will tend to be really bad for kids because suddenly their parent isn't there to provide them with care. Having to step in and provide care for younger siblings is not psychologically very good for older kids. When divorce forces them, to move out of their neighborhood, away from their peers and positive adults, right, that's bad as well. I talked about that already. And when children are encouraged to take sides, so if the divorce is contentious and the parents are still fighting, and especially if parents try to get the kids on side or use the kids as a weapon, so, it's get divorced if you have to, but don't be like my friend's ex, constantly threatening, like, if you don't do this, then you're never going to see your kids again. That is not good for your kids. She's not the nicest person. I tried to warn him. It didn't work. I think it came down to, but she's so pretty. Wow, this is way back. We're really catching up. Okay. Sorry, it's like last class. Okay, well, we can go back. Our mate selection slide. What do I mean by potential spouses bring resources to the marriage market? Well, you bring certain things to the like the marriage market. How to put this? Basically, like if you put it in market terms, right? We're all shopping for romantic or not all of us, but a lot of us are shopping for romantic partners. A good number of us still want to get married, and so you are on the marriage market. Not me. I've been married forever. But you are on the marriage market, right? You are trying to find someone who will buy your product or a product that you can buy. That's a terrible metaphor, but we're going to go with it. You're not buying another human being, I promise. And, both parties are looking for certain things. So what do you bring to the marriage market? Do you bring, there's a bunch of things that people bring to the marriage market. Economic, usually potential, especially if you get married young, or economic success, right? So how well off are you? How good is your job? How much money do you think you could make? Sorry, I saw the next question and I'm already thinking about it. It's a good question though. So you bring stuff, right? How attractive are you, right? That is part of what you bring to the marriage market, right? What are your beliefs and values? How well do they line up with other people? How young are you, right? Especially, how likely is it that you're gonna be able to have kids? All of these sorts of things, right? Do you have any baggage, right? Like children or other emotional baggage. That's sounding worse and worse. Dear God. I seem to have lots of friends with issues. That's what happens when you get into your 40s, man. All of your friends' lives start to fall apart, and you're just like holding on, hoping it doesn't happen to you. Enjoy that. Enjoy your 20s and 30s. It gets much, much worse after this. Hey, I've had friends die of drug overdoses. I got all sorts of shit going on. I'm relatively well-adjusted myself, though. Okay, so yeah, the marriage market, right? You bring stuff that makes you either an attractive or unattractive potential marriage partner. And it's a lot of things like, your background, your religious beliefs, your values, your economic potential, your looks, and all of that stuff. Okay, why would cohabitation be a predictor of divorce? I thought if you live together before you get married, you are more likely to make a better decision. That is what almost everyone thinks. The only problem is that almost everyone is wrong. And sadly, sociology sometimes tells us that our instincts are incorrect. Okay, there's a couple of things here. So, I'm like, how deep do I answer this question? And do I let it derail the entire rest of the class? Sure feels that way. Sorry. Oh my God. Isn't the 40s like the lowest point in most people's lives in terms of happiness? Yeah, I think that's about right. I'm doing good though. I have a hot tub. That's how I roll. Okay, I drive a minivan, but I have a hot tub, so it all kind of works out. Okay, so why is cohabitation a predictor of divorce? It's a complicated question. It's a really good one. People tend to think it's the opposite, right? Because you've test-driven the relationship like you would test drive a Mazda, and that should give you a chance to kind of do better. Okay, but a couple of things. One key point. Religious people, the people who are most likely to value marriage and think that it's permanent, right, and that it cannot be broken. What God has united, let no man tear asunder. Quoting Matthew Broussard? Okay. I got Bible quotes in my brain. Those people are the least likely to cohabitate, right? They're also the most likely to kind of get married and think that you cannot get divorced. So you have a religious aspect. People who cohabit tend to be less traditional, right? And therefore, they are going to think that marriage is much more optional, much more based on emotions, much more based on how you feel than on your own happiness than some kind of permanent union that can't be broken for cultural or religious reasons. So that's probably the biggest one, right? It's one side is very traditional, one side is not. That's probably like the biggest factor. There's other ones as well. I mean, you have tended to have, more sexual experiences if you cohabit. So you have more kind of comparisons, and that generally doesn't go as well, right? The fewer sexual partners you've had in your life, the more likely you are to stay happily married, because I guess you don't know what else is out there. All sorts of things. It's a complicated question. I would say it's mostly that first one. is that people who are going to cohabit are less traditional and therefore less likely to see marriage as something that needs to be permanent. And therefore, when shit goes bad, and it does, right? Because at some point, your partner, be they male or female, is going to get old, fat, and ugly. So probably. I mean, I'm old, fat, and ugly, so it kind of works out. I'm talking about myself, right? You're going to be dissatisfied with something. Or that personality thing comes out. They start to turn into their parents. Parenting styles, you have kids, things get really hard. People get less happy. They're more likely to sort of, look at exiting marriage as more of a possibility. So that's probably the number one thing. And yeah, I mean, let's put it this way. If you're more likely to say you want to cohabit to test out the relationship, there's a good chance that you kind of feel like relationships aren't a permanent thing and you have one foot out the door kind of all the time, or you have the possibility in your mind that you can just leave this relationship if it doesn't go the way you want. So there's all sorts of psychological things as well. Thank you. I think I have a good sense of humor too, right? It's a good thing I'm just going to say I got no hair. It's a good thing I got married young. Okay. So, I like to joke about myself. I have tremendous self-esteem, and if anything, my ego is a problem. If I ever want to kill myself, I'll just climb up on my ego and jump off. So, that's, no. That's... That got real dark. That got real dark, yeah. I like the dark. I have a very dark sense of humor, too. You should ask my kids. My kids will tell you I have the darkest sense of humor. And it's very dry. So, all right, economic hardship. So, when we talk about divorce, the people most affected by divorce tends to be women historically. Now, that's changing a little bit as women start to out-earn men. But there's still a class dynamic here. We have the bulk of divorces coming from the working class, right? And in the working class, women tend to make much less money than men do. So, I mean, working class women will tend to be in industries like childcare, beauty services, I'm forgetting one, hospitality. Are the big ones, hospitality and retail, which have much worse wages than working class male jobs like trades. So typically, husbands have earned more than wives. Again, that's changing in the middle and upper classes. It's becoming more even, or even women outperforming men generally. But historically, it's been the case that women saw declines in income, right? Declines in living standards following divorce, and things like child support only make up a small percentage of of the income that you had, right? So yeah, it involves typically the non-custodial parent paying money for purposes of supporting the children, but it's, they're often inadequate, and a lot of people find ways to avoid paying child support. Okay. I already talked about this. I'm terrible at my job. I know it's on all these slides. It's all in my brain, so I never, I always get it out of order. So, yes, one of the big kind of things that happens with kids is they reduce contact with the non-resident parent. This is considerably worse for boys, right? It's harder on boys, typically, because the most likely non-resident parent is the male parent in the household, and so boys often miss the same-sex parent and often have trouble with their mothers, right? Definitely true with my 11-year-old. He really just wants to play Fortnite, and his mom is horrified by the idea of Fortnite and people shooting each other with guns. She still hasn't quite gotten used to Nerf guns, and Fortnite is a bridge too far. And they fight about it a lot, and if I wasn't there, it would be ugly. Okay, so yeah, basically, if they still have a lot of contact with the non-resident parent, it can be somewhat mitigated. And, I mean, added to the kind of complexity, about half of divorced parents subsequently remarry or cohabit, right? So a lot of people move out of a marriage and get into another relationship. And I will say, from my experience, this is often at shocking speed. I had one, it wasn't a friend of mine, it was a friend of my wife's, and basically they got divorced, and 2 weeks later, he was living with someone else and she was dating someone else, and I'm like, was this already happening while you guys were married and I just didn't know about it? Anyway, it often happens shockingly quickly. Yeah, one of the things though, when we get into blended families or step families, a lot of children living with step-parent households actually derive very little benefit from the additional income or supervision that step-parents bring. And one of the things that weirdly happens is step-parents often don't invest either financially or emotionally. That heart has holes in it. That's going to be a problem. Financially or emotionally in their stepchildren, right? They don't invest either way. So often what will happen, especially if there are other children born out of the new union, those children get the bulk of the attention and stepchildren don't receive really any of the financial or supervisory benefits. And often step-parents feel like they shouldn't be forced to or can't parent stepchildren. Okay. You're so you're so sweet. Oh, that's very nice. You don't have to make me feel better about myself. As I said, I feel fine. I like to joke about myself because it's an easy joke to make. My self-deprecating humor gets a laugh, and that's all I really care about. I'm here to entertain you and educate you. Mostly, I mean, I've always said my backup career, if the professor thing doesn't work out, is really mediocre stand-up comedian. And so I kind of try out my material as I go. Okay. So, this has all been a long, very boring stand-up routine, if you can't tell. So, hopefully the class is not actually boring. I'm kidding. So, if parents get divorced after the kid becomes an adult and moves out, does it have a big effect on them? Is there any studies on that I know of? I have read studies to this effect, and it often does still shake people's sense of self, right? They still have a so the term that we use is like ontological security, a security that you know who you are, right? And you know where you came from, and you had a kind of solid basis. And divorce of your parents almost at any age will ultimately kind of shake this, right? So yeah, even after you've moved out and become an adult, if your parents choose to get divorced at that point, it can still shake people's sense of self. Now, it doesn't have as big of an impact as it would, say, on like, you know, middle school to kind of end of high school, where it's going to be very, very detrimental, but it still impacts people in their sense of self. It is, okay, I can talk about this all day. I know a lot about this. It's worse in a lot of senses for religious people, because religious people may invest in their parents' marriage a sense of the sacred, right? A sense that their marriage is somehow connected to faith and God and all of that stuff. And when that breaks down, it can shake people's both kind of identity and their religious identity, which can be super, super detrimental. Okay, but yes. Oh, well, thank you. I'm here all week. Well, till Friday. All right, so reproductive choice. So obviously one of the big changes in kind of family forms, the growth of families and all that has been around reproductive choice. Basically, you know, women particularly have much more control over their fertility than at any time in the past, right? So basically women can choose, basically sex and reproduction have been fundamentally separated in major ways. So women can now basically choose anywhere in the Western world, especially whether they have children, and if so, how many children they want to have, and very importantly, when they want to have them, right? And this is typically exercised through two things: contraception in its various forms, the pill, IUDs, you know, all of the forms of contraception that are available. There's so many of them now that it's a panoply. And abortion, right? And typically abortion, you know, is used when contraception fails. Abortion becomes an option, right? So that part of the kind of sexual revolutions promised that women could control their fertility, because birth control tends to be a little bit, some forms of birth control, the pill especially, and condoms aren't 100% effective. Pregnancies still do happen, so abortion is there as a sort of backstop when contraception fails. So both of those things are essentially possible and allow women to control their fertility. Yeah, I mean, The attitudes on abortion and other forms of reproductive technology and reproductive choice vary widely, especially by age, education, religious beliefs, and of course by the circumstances that led to abortion. Like if we look at it, virtually no one, not no one, but virtually no one has any objection to abortion in the cases of rape, incest, or if the baby is non-viable, right? If it's going to die shortly after birth, or if continuing the pregnancy would put the life of the mother at jeopardy, or in jeopardy rather. So those are pretty much uncontroversial. There are kind of differences in attitudes, especially religious belief seems to be the real key one, right? The more religiously conservative and especially like Roman Catholic evangelical you are, the more likely you are to oppose abortion. It remains a divisive issue, and interestingly, while most Canadians, if you ask them like a yes or no question as to whether they would want abortion to be made illegal, the vast majority weeks it should be allowed at. People have different views whether it should be allowed in all circumstances or only some circumstances. It gets really, really complicated, and Canadians are much less unified in terms of their views on abortion than it might seem on the surface, where there's actually a lot of diversity. And it's something like, a solid 45% of Canadians would be in favor of abortion being banned after 20 weeks, right? So currently there's no kind of legal limit on abortion in terms of weeks in Canada. So there's a lot of variance, and the later you get in the pregnancy, the more likely it is for people to say that it shouldn't be allowed. So there's still a lot of contention in Canada around questions of abortion. Okay, and yeah, for some women, reproductive choice means facilitating pregnancy and birth by means of reproductive technologies. And this is especially true as women seeking to have children are overwhelmingly today older. Right? Most women typically in the past started having children somewhere between like 18 and 25. But increasingly, we have women in their 30s and into their early 40s who are looking to get pregnant and have children. Why? Well, because they're getting married later, right? As we've started to see marriage as a capstone, not something you do at the beginning of your adult life, but something that you do after you've established career, once you've had fun, once you've discovered yourself, and all that jazz. Increasingly the age of the mother at her first pregnancy, or when her first child is born, is trending towards about 28. And more people in their 30s and 40s are trying to have kids. This, however, is somewhat problematic. As you get older and as you move through your 30s, it becomes harder and harder to have a child for both men and women, but especially for women. So more people are leaning into things like artificial insemination, surrogates, right? Surrogates never used to be a thing, but surrogates are becoming more of a thing. And actually, this is especially true for LGBTQ people, especially gay people. You see a lot of use of surrogates for gay couples, right? Gay men wanting to have a child. Obviously, biologically, that's really difficult. Impossible. But they often use surrogate mothers. And then things like in vitro fertilization. Also, of course, there's also various screening techniques, especially for things like Down syndrome and other medical conditions that have made questions of abortion much more viable and allowed people to choose whether they want to have, say, a child with certain forms of disability. Okay, maybe we'll stop there. We'll pick it up. We should finish this on Friday pretty easily. And we'll go on to the next unit.